Prayers. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. O Lord, our Governor, bless the President of our country, that she may be a light of peace among the people and a blessing to other nations of the earth. Lord, keep this nation under your care. For the Prime Minister and members of the Cabinet, and to all the administrative authority, grant wisdom and grace in the exercise of their duties. Give grace to your servants, O Lord. For the members of the Senate and the House Assembly, and for those who make our laws, give courage, wisdom, and foresight to provide for the needs of all your people and to fulfill our obligations in the community of nations. Give grace to your servants, O Lord. Let us pray for the Senate. Almighty God, our Heavenly Father, send forth, we beseech you, upon your servants who bear office in this country, the spirit of charity and justice, that they may in all things walk before thee with steadfast purpose and a single heart, and faithfully serve in their several offices, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. As you've taught us, we pray together saying, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Almighty Father, we thank you for the blessings of this new day. We thank you for the ability to exchange and debate and to share. We ask for your continual guidance and protection on our nation from hurricane and from disaster. We ask you in this month of national significance to guide us, give us that sense of purpose, and continue to direct us along the ways that lead to eternal life. Bless our work and all that we are called to do. Bless those who minister in this country and across this world. We make these prayers this day in the name of Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior. Amen. And may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit rest and remain with us and all we love this day and forevermore. Amen.
Amen.
The Senate is in session.
Messages from Her Excellency the President. Announcements by Your Honor the President.
With respect to announcements, I have notice of absence from Her Honor the Deputy President, Senator Thompson, who is traveling on government business, from Senator Reverend Dr. Rogers, and Senator Maladu. These are all absent today. And the announcements in light of the absence on business of the Deputy President, we need to invite nominations for someone to act so we can chair our committees with the bills.
Mr. President, I beg.
Okay, we'll consider that under motions. The other mass-related announcements, I've received the minutes of a meeting held on Wednesday, the 12th of October, 2022 for confirmation. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move the adoption of the minutes of the last sitting of the Senate.
The question is that these minutes be confirmed. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. The minutes stand confirmed.
Presentation of petitions, presentation of papers.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I'm commanded to lay the 2020 annual report and audited financial statements for the National Petroleum Company Corporation. This is for the period ending March 31st, 2020, as well as the agreement for the establishment of a partnership between member states of the Caribbean community, and the African Export-Import Bank, Afri-Exim Bank.
Reports from select committees, questions to ministers, requests for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on matters of urgent public importance, statements by ministers or parliamentary secretaries, personal explanations, motions relating to the business or citizens of the Senate, and moved by minister.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move the nomination of Senator Dr. the Honourable Christopher Maynard to sit as the chairman of committees for the remainder of today's sitting.
The question is, Senator Mr. Maynard, the chairman of committees for the remainder of today's sitting. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Therefore, so confirmed. And before letting too many tales out of school, this is not the first thing that we sat in proximity to one another. We did it at school. But what happened at school will stay at school. Senator Maynard obviously learned well, they did not. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move at this time the suspension of Standing Order 45-2 for the remainder of today's sitting.
The question is that Standing Order 45-2 be suspended for the remainder of today's sitting. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. The Standing Order is so suspended for the remainder of today's sitting.
Introduction of bills.
Senator Cummins. Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move the first reading of the following bills: the Civil Aviation Bill 2022, the Civil Aviation Air Navigation Services and Accident Investigation Bill 2022, as well as the first reading of the Firearms Amendment Bill 2022.
The question is that those bills so mentioned be read the first time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Public business, sir.
Public business is now the order of the day.
Order number 1, in the name of the Honourable Minister of State in the Prime Minister's office, to move the second reading on the Financial Services Commission Amendment Bill 2022.
Senator Dr. Monroe Knight.
Mr. President, I beg that the matters on the order paper relating to the Financial Services Commission, Amendment Bill 2022, as well as the Financial Services Commission Miscellaneous Provisions and Validation Bill 2022, be taken as a cognate debate.
The question is that these two matters related to the Financial Services Commission be taken as a cognate debate. Just to remind members that the matters will still be voted on individually as per the order paper, but discussion and debate under this proposed, if senators agree, will take place all within this one debate. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Please proceed, Senator Dr. Morganite.
Mr. President, this cognate debate presents two matters for consideration of this chamber. The first matter relates to the amendment to the composition of the Financial Services Commission by amending the first schedule to clarify the actual composition of the commission. And the second amendment, Mr. President, provides for a new fee structure by the Commission and validates the charging of the fees, charging and collection of fees under the new arrangement. Essentially, Mr. President, these amendments will allow for the more efficient functioning of the Financial Services Commission and their ability to better regulate the sector. The Financial Services Commission is an entity that is charged with regulating specifically, Mr. President, the non-banking sector, right? So whereas the central bank will regulate those in the banking sector, the Financial Services Commission has overall responsibility to ensure the regulatory compliance of those entities in the non-banking sector. And when we talk about entities in the non-banking sector, Mr. President, we're talking about, for instance, credit unions. We're talking about entities that operate insurance companies, pension plans, mutual funds, securities, and so on. So entities that are not within the banking sector, that are covered by various other acts and regulations, those fall under the purview of the Financial Services Commission. So that the Commission plays a very, very essential role, Mr. President, in the context of ensuring that Barbadians can have confidence in the operation of these entities that fall outside of the banking sector. It is important to recall that the FSC was established, Mr. President, because there was actually regulatory breaches. And if I believe that we would all recall the collapse of CLICO in 2009, and that collapse, Mr. President, had dire consequences for Barbadians and other investors who lost millions during the collapse of CLICO. And we know that that collapse was caused through a failure of corporate governance, but also as well, as it is reported in the context of the CLICO debacle, that it was also as well because of poor regulatory oversight. So that we had the establishment of the Financial Services Commission in 2011 as a direct response to ensuring that we corrected what took place in the context of the 2009 CLICO fiasco in order to ensure that we could have an entity, an omnibus entity that will provide for better regulation of the entire sector. So that, for me, Mr. President, I believe that the 2009 CLICO affair then provides for us a pinpoint as to why we need an entity like the FSC to be operating and providing the necessary regulation in order to ensure that the investments of ordinary Barbadians, that the investment of all Barbadians can be properly protected. And Mr. President, there is a feeling or even a school of thought that perhaps we are over-regulating. That we are regulating in a way that will stop the dynamism and growth of the sector, particularly one that is emerging. We're hearing now of new instruments in fintech and cryptocurrency, etc. But I would ask, Mr. President, do we prefer to have sufficient regulation that ensures the necessary oversight, or do we want to err on the side where we could possibly not have sufficient and effective regulation, and therefore we could then jeopardize the investments and, importantly, the confidence, because that is important, Mr. President. It is the confidence in knowing that there is somebody offering the level of oversight. And very often, the Financial Services Commission does not go out there as the big bad wolf and saying, shut down because there is a breach. But the Financial Services Commission works with entities in order to ensure that those breaches can be corrected and that they can operate up to the standard. Because it is extremely important that we have entities that are operating, as I said, Mr. President, before, these are credit unions. And we know the value and the heartstring pull of credit unions to the Barbadian psyche. So that the FSC, in the context of its regulatory role, is intended to be able to provide that help and assistance to these entities. And Mr. President, as I talk about credit unions, I do want to note that currently there are 29 credit unions that the FSC has oversight for, and based on the records of the Financial Services Commission, there are approximately 229 million members, that's million credit union members, as of June 2022. And this actually represents an increase from previous quarters. So what we are seeing that even in the context of where we would have had COVID and where people's income might have been stretched, that as we have come out of COVID, that Barbadians are more and increasingly invested within the credit union. But importantly, Mr. President, the statistics also show that the total savings of the 29 credit unions stand at 2.6 billion. 2.6 billion, with an asset base of 3.04 billion. And therefore, there's a high level of liquidity within the sector. And this is significant because, again, when we talk about the credit union, it is often persons who are investing sometimes small amounts, $100 from their from their pay pack, in order then to be able to save for their children's education, to be able to save for their house, for their homes, in order to save for their small businesses. So the importance of a strong regulator cannot be underestimated. And Mr. President, I also want to speak about my own experience, because certainly, and this may be giving away my age, I grew up in a time when I knew what a susu was. My daughter doesn't, if I tell my daughter about susu, she won't know who is that, right? But I understood what a susu was. I understood the value of saving, and also as well the importance of the credit union. So on my very first job, my first act was to go down to the credit union and open 2 accounts. One, normal account where I could put some money on, but also as well another account that I could save in order to put towards my home. So that there is importance in having well-regulated entities, and I just pull out the credit union, Mr. President, but across the non-banking sector, it is important, particularly in the context of pensions, etc., that we have that strong protector, guardian even, that we can call it, that helps to be able to regulate. I spoke about before, Mr. President, the Clico debacle, and as I was thinking about this bill this morning, I was wondering to myself, what would happen if all of these millions of people within the credit union movement had to suffer a collapse of one of the credit unions, had to lose their savings? What would happen? within this context. And I think that is important. So the FSC, Mr. President, regulates over 800 entities, and therefore that collectively manage billions of dollars in assets and representing therefore significant investments by Barbadians. And therefore, even as Barbadians, we are asked to invest more, to be able to make sure that our savings actually grow. We also need, on the other end, to be confident that as we do that, that they will be safe as well. I want to also stress, Mr. President, the importance of doing public education, because even as I have focused on the need for a strong regulator, the need for a strong guardian, the need for strong oversight, it is also important that Barbadians themselves also understand the importance of investing, how the vehicles actually work, how the FSC can help protect their funds, and how and which vehicles will allow them to have the best returns and with less risk, so that we match the regulatory framework, the strong regulatory framework in the context of the Financial Services Commission, as well with an education program that ensures that Barbadians are aware and even more aware of how they fit within the context of these investment vehicles. And Mr. President, I want to highlight the fact that this government has very strategically taken on that role of education through the Literacy Bureau that was established, and the Financial Literacy Bureau that was established in 2020. And that was a commitment made by this government in order to ensure, and we use the banner of no one left behind, so that ordinary Barbadians, and the target for the Financial Literacy Bureau is not just Barbadians, who may have some monies to put in a vehicle, but also as well the target was school children, so that we are building capacity from a young age in order to be able to understand the importance of investment, the importance of creating generational wealth, so that those that can benefit from such vehicles are not just those that have some knowledge, or like I said, have some funds, but that we can create that awareness from ground up of the importance. I want to also reference as well IDB report also of 2020, which noted that for Latin America and the Caribbean, prior to the pandemic, 6 out of 10 persons reported that they lacked the resources to cover an emergency. And according to that report, the vast majority of those were in the poorer quintile. So prior to COVID, we have a situation in Latin America and the Caribbean in which 6 out of 10 persons are reporting that they lacked the resources. And that report, however, also noted the importance of financial literacy as being closely correlated with what I would call household resilience, Mr. President, the ability of households to be able to withstand shock by being better educated in terms of how to use their funds and where to fit them. So, Mr. President, as I'm saying, so we are focusing, yes, on making sure that we have a strong regulatory environment in the context of the FSC, but also as well there is sufficient education so that people are aware in terms of the operations. So the FSC, Mr. President, like I said before, creates an omnibus commission that brings all of the various previous acts for these that governed these non-banking operations under one portfolio. And what that helps with is to be able to build coherence and, importantly, accountability coherence, and accountability. Previously, Mr. President, the FSC would have also have been subsidized directly by government. It was taking in some income, but it was insufficient to carry its operations. And therefore, the government had to be subsidizing FSC in order to supplement for its operations. Now, an organization, again, that is a regulator needs to have, Mr. President, some level of independence in its operations. It needs to be flexible. I talked about dynamism before. And reliance on the public purse continually can stymie that. And it was important, therefore, that the Financial Services Commission was able to move to a position in which then it could fully fund its operations. And for government, that was also important, because once the FSC is able to be independent and able to have its own resources to manage, it means that government can move those resources that were previously allocated to the FSC now into other things that are important, and especially into social programming. So that the context of the amendment that seeks to allow for the FSC to charge and to make sure that it can have charges that will allow it to then be able to manage its affairs then becomes extremely important in this context, Mr. President. The fees that are charged there and that are presented in the context of the amendment are fees that have been benchmarked internationally and regionally. And in the context of the development of those fees and charges, the FSC has reported that it looked to make sure that it would be fair across the entities that would have to pay those fees, Mr. President, in order to ensure, as I said, that there was fairness across the entities, and that both the FSC and those that it regulated could then operate efficiently, Mr. President. So that what this allows for is for the FSC then to be able to operate to scale. And we can see as well that in the context of the operations of the Financial Services Commission, that it is attempting to be able to adapt. I spoke before about, the whole issue of fintech and cryptocurrencies. And Mr. President, I must admit that these are things that I now need to be able to learn, and I will be looking out for when the Financial Literacy Bureau is having its session, so that I can also be educated to be able to understand how I can benefit from this new market. And even as this market is emerging, the Financial Services Bureau has moved already to establish an advisory committee on the expansion of the fintech sector in order to ensure, one, that those that are coming into the sector can understand the regulatory framework, but also as well so that it can be responsive to some of the issues in the context of the regulatory framework. So as we Mr. President, consider these amendments. They're really about intending to make sure that the FSC can be responsive, it can have the resources that it needs, and both technical and human resources, in order then to efficiently dispatch its mandate in terms of the regulatory environment. The amendment to the first schedule, as it relates to the composition of the committee, seeks, Mr. President, to make specific inclusion for the Director of Finance and Economic Affairs as an ex officio officer or his nominees. And this, again, allows for the necessary oversight, make sure the government is aware, Mr. President, of what is happening so that we're not caught off guard as well, and that there is a symbiotic relationship that is happening in the context of the regulatory environment and what is happening in terms of government and its policies. So that we are, again, making the Financial Services Commission, Mr. President, a fit-for-purpose organization. Yeah, again, given the environment that we are seeing emerging. I want to finally, Mr. President, reiterate the point again in respect of the need to ensure that we have a regulatory body that is going to be able to dispatch its function in the most efficient way, and is also as well independent and not necessarily dependent on government funding. I recall, Mr. President, that even in the context, and I spoke about the credit union before, and we can talk about discussions over pension funds and mutual funds, etc., that there are questions that will come up from ordinary Barbadians that have to do with the operations of these entities and how they are going to be able to either access their funds over the long-term period or the eventualities that will emerge in the context of something happening. And what you have seen the FSC progressively doing is to enhance its own accountability and transparency, and as well at the same time making sure that these agencies that it regulates are also more accountable and transparent as well through its reporting facility, so that you can acquire through the FSC critical information on the operations of these entities, including their assets, their liabilities, Mr. President, look at their level of liquidity, look at their savings, etc. So that at the level of the regulator, what you are seeing happening within the context of the sector is also growing transparency that will rebound to the benefit of ordinary citizens, Mr. President, as they put their monies and their confidence in the non-banking sector. Mr. President, I do not beg that this bill be read a second time.
Senator King.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I shan't be long on this, but there's a couple of things that I think we need to mention. I am not by any stretch of the imagination, Mr. President, a superstitious man. But when I looked at the FSC's web page and took a look, one of the first things that struck me was that it was established on April the 1st, 11 years ago. Now, when you stop to think about it, and we are 11 years later and we have to make changes and to move forward. Like I said, I'm not a superstitious man. But the average person out there who will probably see things like that and thinks in a different way would start to wonder, what is this really all about? Or somebody trying to trick me or whatever else. This move by government is intended to be proactive. As you look around the world, financial services are changing. Technology is changing. All sorts of new things are coming in. And I remember, as mentioned earlier, some of the failings of some of what were considered then standard institutions left a number of Barbadians totally financially wrecked. And there seemed to be, at that time, no real sort of regulatory bodies or no recourse for these persons to get back monies that they would have invested and lost and these types of things. One of the things that the FSC says quite clearly is that they're there to minimize the risk to consumers and to those persons who borrow money from such entities, as mentioned earlier, that are not banks. And like I said, in today's world, with the new technologies coming in, more ideas floating about as to how people can provide services that were traditionally done in a certain way. We have got to be proactive and to be able to put things in place, not only just protect our people from who may be unscrupulous persons who may seek to capitalize on the fact, knowing full well that these small territories within which we live in and who are not necessarily responsible for a lot of the technological advances in these areas, to be susceptible to these kinds of entities coming in and taking advantage of people. And I think this is important, that this particular entity is established and is strengthened and given all the support necessary that it can carry out its function in a way that creates more confidence in persons. Now, we are also asking people to become, as they say, more financially literate and to be less risk averse and invest in different things and try to get sources of passive income and grow and save and do all of these things. And you also have entities that are now making it easier for you to transfer money from one place to the next without going through the banking system. And all I'm saying, Mr. President, is that with all of these things coming at people, those persons who are older in age might not be the ones who are going to be interested or going to be affected by these sorts of things, because, you know, older persons tend to deal with things in the way that they're comfortable. But you have a younger population that is coming up. And if they don't fully grasp or understand or are protected in any way, when these types of things begin to become the norm within your society, then I fear that you may have many more stories of persons being taken advantage of, put it nicely, through these sorts of services. So I just want to give my support to it, because I think it's a step in the right direction. But as mentioned earlier, yes, we have to do a lot more in terms of giving people information about not only the commission itself, but about the other entities and instruments and all the other things that are going to be available to us as time progresses. And so with those few words, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator King. Any other speakers? Senator Kevin Boyce.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Mr. President. I rise to join the debate on this bill in the context of having had some experience with the operation of the FFC. And I think it's important to recognize the efforts that the FFC makes in relation to the supervision and regulation of the non-banking financial institutions. And this experience would have come out in assisting with a matter which called for a certain level of interaction with a variety of players. You have sophisticated accountants like yourself, sir. You have well-heeled lawyers like Senator Nichols, sir. And you, of course, have the government regulators and the government officials whose mandate is to operate and run things as best as fiscally possible. And what I found during that experience, sir, was that the importance of this body is really something integral to our financial stability. And is almost one of those unsung heroes in the context of it's a regulator. And you don't miss the regulator until something happens. I think it's important that when we have this debate, we recognize the context and the service that it provides and be mindful of the government's attempt to bolster its operation. I think that should be the starting point in any discussion that we have today, sir. Now, it's stated that it was established, sir, in April 2011, as Senator King indicated, by the FFC Act of 2010. It deals with insurance companies, pensions, we know how important that issue is now, sir, securities, mutual funds, credit unions. And historically, it would have replaced the Securities Commission and the Supervisor of Insurance, as the office then was. There are also certain elements, sir, of money laundering and prevention of terrorism acts, which fall within the function. So it's one of those entities which is important, is necessary to provide a layer of protection, and provides that in a context where it may be taken for granted, especially given these times where government finds itself having to allocate fiscal space to priorities. having to allocate fiscal space to priorities such as housing, water, transportation. And it's only after you realize certain things and certain consequences, you say, oh shoot, maybe this is something that we need to do. And what we see, sir, by this legislation that is proposed, and I think Senator King touched on it, and I also believe that the Honourable Minister Monroe Knight mentioned it as well, the origination of the body, and these are not my words, sir, came out of what was labeled as a lapse of regulation. Recognizing the need for regulatory sophistication, sir, it was established. Now, what this legislation seeks to do, and I will then add on to my friend Senator King, is that it seeks to make some modifications and provide some revenue to allow the entity to operate and also to validate some previous charges. So previously, let's look at the composition. It was previously 7 persons appointed by the minister in terms of the overall regulation. We now have specific reference to the Director of Finance and Economic Affairs, along with 6 other persons to deal with the regulation of this body. That's the first part of the act, and that's the first change. The second change of the legislation seeks to establish a new fee structure. Now, part of it is to validate certain fees that were previously charged, and we recognize that as a parliament, there is a certain power you have to validate that which was done previously, sir. And these were fees which were charged from April 2019. So we're going to deem them to be lawful, sir. It moves some of the duties from the minister to the commission, which hopefully will then free up the minister to focus on policy directives and allow the commission the independence, resources, and even some would say validity to attack certain issues that were once in the minister's domain. I would recommend, sir, that particular attention be paid to Section 126 of the Securities Act, which is proposed to be modified by this documentation, because it is a piece of legislation that comes up somewhat often in the commercial courts in the context of takeover bids and the conducts of parties. The input of regulators such as the FFC to give guidelines and encouragement to the legislators as to how to make this process a bit smoother will certainly reduce the amount of litigation, albeit taking food out of some persons' mouths. Now, sir, there's also specific provision for the commission to make regulation for the operation of mutual funds. And mutual funds are something, sir, which at one time were incredibly sexy. I often speak to starting work under the Owen Arthur regime, in which your investment in mutual funds, they were then given a tax break. And as a young person, I hope I don't age myself too much, but as a young person during that time, starting off, the concept of putting $2,000 a year and then getting a tax break for that was certainly very attractive. That, however, has gone the way of many other things, however, has been offset by a reduction in your income tax rate. However, that being said, mutual funds are some things which I find particularly attractive in the context of it allows person to invest with minimal input, recognizing, of course, those who cry that if we don't have anything left over, how can we invest? But if you do, mutual funds tend to be an attractive investment, especially if you can get in as soon as possible. I tell my associates in the firm, sir, and by aside, 20 years there today, sir, but I tell my associate in the firm a story of when I went to a financial institution. And I went to the financial institution to start my investment journey, sir. And I went there, and a very pleasant young lady asked, well, how much are you looking to start with? And I quite proudly said $500. And I sat outside that financial institution for a long time waiting for someone to come and see me. But the lesson there, though, is that you start small, you make some sacrifices, and we recognize that all persons cannot or are not in a position to do that. But those who can, a portion of your salary, you pay yourself first, and you utilize the avenue of things like mutual funds, things like credit unions, to allow you to then gain some element of income growth and investment, because we all know about inflation, sir, and what it does with the little monies that you have. So it's important that these bodies who are taking your money are regulated so that you are protected and we protect those in the society who are now seeking to become captains of capital like certain members. And in their seeking to grow at their most vulnerable stage is when they would need more protection. So that's where the FFC comes into play, sir, by ensuring that this level of investment is protected. Sir, as proposed, it would also is that Freudian? As proposed, it would also deal with the issue of credit unions, who we recognize receive a huge amount and certainly have done very well for Barbadians in terms of the investments that they offer. The question as the level of regulation as opposed to the level of benefits which credit unions receive is a topic for another discussion, sir. But certainly I am pro-regulation, perhaps a bit soft touch, but in terms of protecting, which also ties in with, I believe the government recently expanded the deposit insurance to apply to credit unions, or will be doing so shortly. That then gives a certain level of protection for those small investors who are the most vulnerable as they seek to grow their asset base. So, sir, all these measures are measures which I think everyone here will have no issue in supporting as they seek to improve the financial landscape of non-banking financial institutions, which I certainly support. And of course, you can't mention non-banking financial institutions without mentioning the insurance companies, sir. We'll leave it at that. Now, sir, it is hoped that through this revenue gathering, the organization, that is the FFC, is able to garner the necessary human and technological resources to allow them to be fully optimized. Now, why do I say human, sir? Sir, I recall in my attempts at studies to do a topic called revenue law. And when I was reading the cases involved in the revenue law study, I could not understand who were the persons who caught the bad guys. The scheme was so sophisticated, it was so elegant, that unless you had an understanding and training and the ability to meticulously pick apart, I'm not talking about no blessings or anything so sweet, I'm talking about a scheme which is so prettily layered that you put in your money and you get it out. You put in your money and you get it out. You get a pretty proposal. You get everything done so well, but when they come for you, your money is gone. And I recall expressing admiration for one of the judges who could actually sit down and listen to the case being argued, but I was saying to myself, who are the persons catching these bad guys? Because the bad guy is nice with it in terms of the level of sophistication. So if we want to put this country in a context where we're able to catch the baddies, the FFC needs to have the money to pay bright persons to work for them. And the simple point is you're not getting the persons like Senator Drake's to come and work for you unless you provide a certain level of remuneration. Now remember, I painted the picture before of interacting with the FFC when you're dealing with the accountants, you're dealing with the lawyers, you're dealing with the operators. So you need to have the internal staff with the competencies to deal with these players at their level of sophistication. Not only do you have to have the internal staff with the appropriate competence, you have to be able to retain them by your remuneration, and you have to give them the technological resources to move at the pace necessary to interact with these players. And I think we need to be cognizant of the 5 main areas that this FFC deals with. You have the insurance company, you have pensions, you have securities, you have credit unions, and you have money laundering and terrorism. That's 5. That's 5. 5 divisions which need heads, which need team members, which need the sophistication to go after these persons and to interact with the players. So certainly, anything which can be done to allow this organization to fulfill its potential should be supported. Another task which the FFC is also saddled with is that they are also required to deal with not only monitoring, Mr. President, but they have to deal with enforcement. So how they're going to enforce if they don't have the resources to 1, identify, 2, catalog, 3, follow up, and 4, bring teeth to bear to any breach. Hopefully by this process, we can take them some way towards that journey. Sir, at a future stage, perhaps we can get into a discussion as to whether or not entities such as these should be totally independent. The concept of the director of finance and 6 persons, while a step removed from the minister, may not be a step far. And there is data, you know I like my sources, sir, London School of Economics, Beasley and Coates, 2013, which says that regulators which are elected tend to have more pro-consumer results than non-elected regulators. But of course, we recognize, sir, that wishes are horses, and this is a case of maybe idealism. But certainly, I think that in the future, we can seek to increase the independence and revenue of this body, which I believe is important to Barbados, and I support the government's efforts to facilitate its function. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Kevin Boyce. Any other speakers on this matter? Senator Nichols.
Mrs. President, I'm obliged to you to join in the contribution to the debate, the amendment to the Financial Services Commissioners Act. And I, like my colleague, Senator Boyce, who spoke, want to join in the debate based on my own experiences of having to deal with the FFC for and on behalf of a number of institutional clients who from time to time have to work with the FFC in the organization of their businesses. It is important for us to set the proper context in why we are making these amendments. And I think Senator Boyce touched a bit on it in terms of giving them the revenue to make them more independent and autonomous in the discharge of their regulatory role in the non-bank financial sector in Barbados. And that is important too, because if the Consolidated Fund does not have enough resources to operationalize the Financial Service Commission, then it would not be able to effectively discharge its statutory duties as set out in the legislation. And we all know that this entity came about largely as a result of the backlash of what we call the CLICO debacle, fiasco, not only here in Barbados, but throughout the Eastern and Southern Caribbean. When that institution virtually imploded, and when we took got the opportunity to look at its financial state, we realized that it was highly leveraged or overly leveraged with assets that could not match the liabilities of the entity, leaving thousands of people across the Caribbean in disarray in terms of not being able to access the annuities that they invested in or even their pensions. Sir, you too will remember that a number of your parliamentary colleagues would have deposited their pensions when the people removed them in 2008 into CLICO. much to their own chagrin, unable to recover as a result of this implosion. And it is important that I say this because I will speak a little bit later to what I call the deep massaging of the Financial Services Commission into the day-to-day affairs of some of its constituents or the entities that it is supposed to regulate within that context. But certainly, we have come a long way. And the 2010 Act, which was passed, amended again by the last Barbados Labour Party administration before the election in 2020 to strengthen the organization, to strengthen the entity, and this is another amendment that goes a long way in that direction. But, sir, one concern that I have, and I'm saying this in full support of the amendments and their retroactive respect, the aspects of those which go to firming up the ability to charge fees, is that I do believe that the regulation of the non-bank financial sector has to settle down because we have not really had it before. And I think that too much attention and focus has been on the whole question of the institutions we call credit unions, which have the largest share of Barbadian investment, of the ordinary Barbadian investment, billions of dollars in assets, which the Honourable Minister in her lead off to the debate gave a more accurate figure. But I say that because my experience in dealing with credit unions and representing their interests, dealing with the Financial Service Commission, has been a little turbulent. And I get the sense that the FSC is trying its best to ensure that its mission, its statutory mandate is exercised in a way that will not allow a situation that caused it to be created and established to come again under its purview. And in asserting that role, I find that the credit unions sometimes find themselves with the FFC overstepping the bounds. And I don't mean to be mean and disingenuous, but certainly we should not be having an argument as to who should act as CEO, where the FFC is telling the credit union that a certain person should not act as CEO because they don't feel that that person is fit and proper to act CEO. In the regulation of the banking sector in Barbados, the central bank has that role. The central bank can't tell First Caribbean Bank who can act as CEO or in its senior management. And certainly in my reading of the Financial Services Commission Act, the disqualification of directors and officers is a power that the FSC holds, and it is a power that it should hold. But under the bylaws of credit unions established under the Cooperative Societies Act, a CEO is not an officer or a director. But here is that the Financial Services Commission is asserting and threatening disqualification and cancellation of the license if its determination as to who in the organization should act as CEO when the CEO goes on vacation. And certainly, I don't think that Parliament, in its wisdom when it passed this legislation, had such an assertive, invasive exercise of administrative power in its mind when it created the Financial Services Commission. The Financial Services Commission is known, sir, to even make determination about use of credit cards among directors traveling in credit unions. And I say to those in the credit union movement, you do as you are required, because it really doesn't make sense fighting up with the regulator. Because at the end of the day, you might win the battle but lose the war. At the end of the day, we don't don't have anything to fear because no credit union in Barbados has gone belly up. In fact, in the history of for the financial services sector in Barbados, it has not been the credit unions that have left thousands of Barbadians out to sea. It has not been the credit unions. It has not been the credit unions that have been giving unlawful political donations in millions of dollars that have featured in the most scandalous way in terms of the demise of one insurance company and the imprisonment of a former minister of government in another. The credit union movement and the credit unions in Barbados have steadfastly done their job, and sir, if it seems I have come to bat for them today, to ask for the FSC in its organization with its new powers which will be given under this legislation is to adopt a framework to ensure that this institution, which is so vital to the ordinary people in this country, all of us have parents, friends, and family who have a credit union account. In fact, there are many, many, many Barbadians who do not even have a bank account. And one can't blame them with the fees that the banks are charging. One can't blame them. But we must ensure, one, that the viability of the credit unions is paramount, the financial stability of those institutions, their solvency is assured, and the Financial Services Commission must be assiduous in that regard. But in terms of dialing down into the day-to-day managerial operations of credit unions, I think that is a stretch, in my view, which the legislation in its current form does not support. And I have said to those institutions which I have happened to come across to render advice, like my old driving instructor taught me, it doesn't make sense being right and dead, because you can be making a turn on the road and say you have the right of way, but you have to be conscious of the other people on the road around you, so that it does not make sense fighting up with the regulators in a way to assert what is essentially a managerial decision that is not contemplated by the legislation in its current form, and then end up with yourself facing a commission with egg on its face. Senator Boyce did make the very interesting observation, Mr. President, that the time may well come for the appointment of members of the commission to be done in a way that is differently set out. The commission, in my view, is too young in its age, its in infancy, just over 10 years. And I believe that what we have right now is working well. I do believe, again, that, like Senator Boyce, that more attention should be paid to the staffing of the commission, so that the board of directors plays what really should be the oversight role in charting the policy direction of the financial sector and ensuring that the commission has the technical capacity to monitor the corporate and financial services sector in Barbados, which is one of its more important roles. I do not recall the Financial Services Commission speaking out as loudly as it ought when Barbadians were faced with these blessing schemes and all these things. I know the Ministry of Finance had taken the role in warning Barbadians about these blessing circles and these schemes. But at the same time, it is the Financial Services Commission's responsibility to give that technical advice and assistance in monitoring the corporate sector. We saw in Barbados too, Mr. President, the creeping up. In fact, I went to pay a bill this morning and I saw that there's a new cash loans business in the mall being set up. We know Christmas is coming around the corner. And again, what do we know of these entities? And certainly the central bank has the power to inspect the books and accounts of banks. And are these entities that are popping up, do the Barbadian public have that comfort that these entities that just prop up offering loans at what I consider to be really amazing interest rates and stuff, and are these compounded interest rates? Is there any advice coming from the commission as to what is on the market? Because there's no real consumer group, advocacy group, really there for Barbadians to assess the products that these entities are offering. And I wonder, Mr. President, whether or not that aspect of the sector is sufficiently regulated. Because I've seen in my time in practice, a number of insurance companies come to Barbados and offer services that are relatively footloose. And when the amount of claims get to a certain level, they fly away, they go, leaving many people out to sea. Great Northern Insurance Company is one that comes to mind, where the Office of the Supervisor of Insurance up to recently is still dealing with claims. They have no physical presence in Barbados apart from a name. They operate in Barbados. They have no asset base, which is something that the Financial Services Commission, like the former Office of the Supervisor of Insurance, was supposed to monitor. So they take premiums from you and me and people like us. And then when somebody hits your car, their car is not insured, you go to them, they don't have the capacity even to fix your car, far less give you a rental for the time that you're out when the car is at the mechanic. So that this institution called the Financial Services Commission has a lot of work to do to ensure that the Barbadian public can go about its business with the comfort that there is an institutional response at the level of the state monitoring the sector. I wonder if the time has not come for us to have a deposit insurance scheme like we have for the banks to ensure the commercial assets of Barbadians who are investing in the non-bank financial sector, to ensure that if there is a problem, at least some basic minimum is recovered. And it may be time for us to look at, and I'm talking particularly about the securities and mutual funds and so forth, as we develop the financial services sector, should we not look at creating and establishing a deposit insurance scheme so that Barbadians may feel more comfortable in putting out their money in the financial instruments that are being offered by these entities. So I say that these two amendments are important in ensuring that we have a well-regulated institution that is properly funded and capitalized to discharge its functions and responsibilities. But I will conclude by reiterating what I said before. Too much attention has been on the part of the FFC into the day-to-day management of credit unions in a way that the insurance companies and the mutual funds, I don't think you could tell any of the mutual funds who can act as CEO when the CEO goes on vacation. They will laugh you out of Bridgetown. But too much attention has been played on that. I understand the impetus, but at the same time, the credit unions of Barbados have never fallen short of the people. With those few words, Mr. President, I'm obliged to you, and I support these bills.
Thank you very much, Senator Nichols. Senator Dr. Hines.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. President, for allowing me to speak. I really appreciate Senator Nichols' presentation, and I think that mine follows nicely. We did not collaborate beforehand. There's just one thing that I would like to raise in respect of these two bills before us. And I'd like to go to the Financial Services Commission Act 2010-21. At 6, it provides information, it provides parameters relating to the licensing and registration. And then 7, we note that there is a register that is to be kept. And these amendments follow in indicating the registration rates and all the rest of the fees and so on. But what I note, and I heard it from Senator Monroe Knight as well, is that there is an emerging area that also requires regulation. Senator Monroe Knight spoke about cryptocurrency. We know that recently in Barbados, and I referred to this before, we had a conference that was all about fintech. Later on today, we will be discussing, in my understanding, the BERT program, which also in there entails elements that include an emphasis on fintech. And this is something that I think we have to pay close attention to in ensuring that we have appropriate regulation for this sector. Now, when we talk about fintech, some elements of fintech we are all quite familiar with already. So ATMs, we use those. Online banking, that is fintech. So that is within the regular banking sector. So that's an extension of banking. But we also have fintech that operates outside of that. So here we can think about things such as peer-to-peer lending. So similar to what Senator Nichols was talking about, but in some virtual formats where persons are able to access loans from other people using technology, peer-to-peer, right? So one person to another using technology. We also have these cryptocurrency exchanges and cryptocurrency apps. And there are a lot of people who may not understand a lot about cryptocurrencies or the blockchain in general. This is part of the reason why this is worldwide, highly unregulated. In fact, Forbes, in an introductory piece where they seek to provide some clarification on what is fintech, it's actually the name of the piece, published in July 2022, says about fintech that many of these remain largely unregulated, particularly in the wild, wild west of the realm of cryptocurrency. And there are some dangers of this. We have regular people who may be trying to see how they can get their money to work for them using these entities. And that is a risk that they take on by themselves. So that is fine. I think we should have some concern over persons taking on these risks. But the point I want to get back to is about registration and regulation. And I'm not seeing from the amendments before us anything that seeks to require registration for such entities that someone who is technically savvy and has the know-how, whether from Barbados or somewhere else, will establish, and how these entities, how we will seek to begin to think about ways of regulating these entities. There are some countries that go to the extreme of saying that cryptocurrencies are not allowed. That's the extreme in regulation. I don't know that that is the direction that we want to go in, but I do think that this is an area that we have to keep our eyes on, because yes, we know that people have lost their money in things like blessing circles, but people can also lose their money in these kinds of initiatives and endeavors that are flashy and new and attractive, and that the government itself seeks to promote as one of these new growth areas for Barbados. So that, Mr. President, is my contribution. I don't have any problems with either of the bills before us. I just hope that we can go further in ensuring that this new element of the financial services sector can be regulated or at least monitored in a way that protects persons who seek to use these, financial technologies, fintech. And that these entities also should be paying registration, like the more traditional ones. So even if we're not certain right now how exactly to regulate, they should at least be registering so that when issues arise, they can be tracked and followed and so on. With these few words, Mr. President, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Hines. Senator Dr. Moroney.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me also thank, all of the honourable members in this chamber who rose to support the amendments before us. I think that there is general agreement that we have need of a strong regulator in the context of the Financial Services Commission that is in the best interest of all, that we have a regulator that is financially independent and that therefore will have all of the necessary resources that it needs in order to be able to regulate, particularly in the context of the emerging environment. Mr. President, in my presentation, I had made mention of the fact that just recently, actually in June of 2022, the Financial Services Commission moved to establish an advisory committee to advise it of the fintech industry and how it is emerging. And I just want to read, if you permit me, Mr. President, the objectives of the committee. The objective of the committees include identifying relevant opportunities, issues, and risks relating to the fintech sector and the implications for Barbados, advising the Commission on key challenges that are unique to the fintech industry, and providing recommendations to address them, as well as recommending factors that could be included in any proposed legislative and regulatory framework to be developed for the regulation and supervision of fintech products. So that, Mr. President, there is a recognition that the area is new and emerging. And what the FSC is saying, before we rush to put something out there, let's have a committee that is able to look at it, look and see where the industry is going, make the necessary recommendations, and they're doing so in a consultative way in terms of ensuring that the players themselves are also at the table to have the discussions, so that as we build out this fintech industry, that we will have a legislative and regulatory framework that, again, Mr. President, as I always speak to, it will be fit for purpose for the players. So, Mr. President, as I said, I think there's general agreement in the context of the proposed amendments, the importance of them, the need for making sure that we have protection for people's investments and their monies across all of the mechanisms in the non-banking sector, and to ensure as well that the FSC, in the context of its operations, is able to discharge the function. Mr. President, I do not beg that this sitting, I do not beg that this bill be read a second time.
The question is that this bill be read a second time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The thinks the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I do not beg that this session be dissolved into committee.
The question is that you do not leave the chair and the Honourable Senate resolve itself to the committee for further consideration of this bill. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
The Senate is in committee. Clause 1.
Chair, I do not beg that clause 1 stand part.
The question is that clause 1 stand part. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, say no. Clause 2.
I do not beg that clause 2 stand part.
The question is that clause 2 stand part. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, say no. Report. Report.
Mr. Chairman, I do not beg that you report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I now do report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee. All those members in favour, please say aye. All those against, please say no. So I can move on.
The chairman has reported to me the passing of one bill in committee.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill be now read a third time.
The question is that this bill be read a third time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill do not pass and be cited as the Financial Services Commission Amendment Bill 2022.
The question is that this bill be now passed and so cited. Third take.
Sorry, Mr. President. I believe that Senator made reference to it being called a bill rather than the act. And if we're asking you to name it, it can no longer be a bill. It would have to be an act. This is something that we have been doing for some time now, and this is something that we should know that we're doing. We are a serious place. We are the upper chamber. We are the Senate. Laws are passed here, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Tate, for clarity, and to ensure I will repeat the citation myself. The question is that this bill be now passed and be cited as the Financial Services Commission Amendment Act 2022. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. This bill is now, if the ayes have it, this bill is now passed and cited as the Financial Services Commission Amendment Act 2022.
Order number 2, sir. In the name of the Honourable Minister of State in the Prime Minister's Office, to move the second reading of the Financial Services Commission Miscellaneous Provisions and Validation Bill 2022.
Senator Dr. Morronite.
I'd like to move that this bill not be read a second time.
The question is that this bill be read a second time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I'd like to move that Your Honour do not leave the chair and the Senate resolve itself into committee for further consideration of the bill.
The question is that it do not leave the chair and the Honourable Senate resolve itself in the committee for further consideration of this bill. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Honourable senators against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
The Senate is in committee.
Clause 1.
Mr. Chairman, I beg that clause 1 stand part.
The question is that clause 1 stand part. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it.
Clause 2.
Mr. Chair, I beg that clause 2 stand part.
The question is that clause 2 stand part. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it.
Clause 3.
Mr. Chair, I beg that clause 3 stand part.
The question is that clause 3 stand part. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it.
Clause 4.
I beg that clause 4 stand part.
Question is that clause 4 stand part. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it.
First schedule.
I beg that the first schedule stand part.
I beg. The question is that the schedule be the schedule to the bill. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. The schedule is on.
The second schedule.
I beg that the second schedule be the schedule to the bill.
The question is that the second schedule be the schedule to the bill. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. You think the ayes have it?
Third schedule.
I beg that the third schedule be the schedule to the bill.
The question is that the third schedule be the schedule to the bill. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. You think the ayes have it?
Report.
Mr. Chair, I do now beg that you report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I now do report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. You think the ayes have it?
The chairman has reported the passing of one bill in committee.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill be now read a third time.
The question is that this bill be read a third time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Thanks, the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill do not pass and be cited as the Financial Services Commission Miscellaneous Provisions and Validation Act 2022.
The question is that this bill be now passed and be cited as the Financial Services Commission Miscellaneous Provisions and Validation Act 2022. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Thanks, the ayes have it. This bill is now so passed and cited.
Order number 4, sir. In the name of the Honourable Leader of the Senate, to move the passing of a resolution that Parliament take note of and approve the Barbados Economic Recovery and Transformation, in brackets, BERT Plan 2022, financial year 2022 to 2023, and financial years 2026 to 2027.
Senator Cummins.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I rise on this occasion to begin the discussion on the resolution before this honourable chamber. But before I do so, I would like to acknowledge my colleague, Senator Dr. the Honourable Chantal Monroe-Knight, who all of us can see is visibly not feeling herself today, but in a demonstration of the usual commitment of the government of Barbados, is present and in her seat at the Senate, serving and doing the business of the people of Barbados. And so I would wish to acknowledge her commitment to the work of the government of Barbados today in pushing through her leadership of that particular resolution just now, despite her visible distress with a cold, which many of us are struggling with. Sometimes we forget that we are all human while serving, and I would want to acknowledge that in her as well. Mr. President, the matter that is before us at this time is a widely discussed, extensively debated, and widely spoken of matter, certainly in all corners of not just Barbados, but in all corners of the globe. Mr. President, we are dealing with, I don't want to talk about unprecedented times, but you know, there's a saying that goes, prophet is not recognized in his own land. And it requires those who are oftentimes on the outside to speak to and to outline the challenges that are before us or the issues that we should be treating to, sometimes in order for us to acknowledge that they are really there. And so I want today, in my presentation of the Burt Resolution, to speak about what the international community at the level of international institutions are saying about what is facing countries around the globe, what different countries are doing and have been advised to do by the international community. And then I want to specifically contextualize that in the Burt program and how Barbados has sought to treat to those challenges. Mr. President, I want to begin by referencing a speech made by the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund earlier this year. And the title is, again, something we have heard from our own. The title says, "Facing Crisis Upon Crisis, How Can the World Respond?" Facing crisis upon crisis, how can the world respond? Now, this is the Managing Director of the IMF, and she's addressing the international community under this theme. I have been able, Mr. President, to find similarly captioned speeches presented by the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean here in our region, by the World Bank, one of the Bretton Woods institutions. I will speak during the course of my presentation on the context for the Bretton Woods institutions in the 1945 period, in the immediate aftermath of such a time as this, where there were unprecedented crises after crisis, the specter and the aftermath of war, and an economic downturn. Mr. President, I have found similarly captioned speeches under similar titles by the United Nations and its institutions, starting with its Secretary General, who spoke on the unprecedented times that the global economy faces and the impact that it is presenting on human development and the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals, on countries advanced, emerging, and developing alike. Mr. President, I have found similar presentations by G20 countries on the question of indebtedness, and they have looked at how indebtedness has evolved in the G20 countries and mechanisms that have been put in place in those economies, which are otherwise known as emerging economies, to respond to the crisis upon crisis that countries are facing. Mr. President, I have also found among non-governmental organizations at the international level, international non-governmental organizations, entities like the South-South Center, Mr. President, because I know that there is sometimes a sense of mistrust. If I were to come to this honorable chamber and say the IMF said, there may be those who may say, well, they just want to lend you money, so it's in their interest to say so. So I have looked at what the World Bank has said. And people may say, well, they just want to lend you money, and so that's what they will say. And then there will be those that, because they will say that, so I have looked at what the UN institutions have said and their developmental role and the role to be played by the Sustainable Development Goals. But I've also looked at those entities that have served as advocacy groups, voices sometimes crying in the wilderness on the issues that are being faced by the countries in the global south, of which Barbados and the countries in the Caribbean are very much members. And they are all, for the first time perhaps in modern history, speaking in different incarnations, in different fora, under a similar theme, facing crisis upon crisis, how can the world respond? And so I'm going to go through, Mr. President, on that basis and identify, one, the challenges that are being presented, two, the responses that are being recommended by these coherent voices speaking in a choir across the globe, advanced, emerging, G20, developing, and I'm also going to include what is being said about countries in the least developing world. Mr. President, I am then going to correlate those things to the actions being taken by this government and this administration to be able to respond to what we are facing. Mr. President, I then, on that basis, would want to say to you that which we already know. We are now post-COVID. We talked about it for the last 2.5 years, COVID was an unprecedented crisis that began in February of 2020. Many of us thought, we're going to go into this first lockdown, we're going to stay inside, and we're going to get on with our lives. Mr. President, when COVID started, no one had any idea about the far-reaching impact that it would have and the decimating impact that it would have, not just on domestic economies, but in particular, Mr. President, on the issues with supply chain and logistic chain interruptions began during COVID as countries went into lockdown mode. Mr. President, in the first 6 months of COVID and the Chinese economy closing down, global production coming out of China decreased by 40%. 40, not 14, by 40%, Mr. President. The resulting impact of that, Mr. President, continues to this day as China, as recently as this week, went into yet another set of lockdowns as a result of one case found in Shanghai. If the world's largest producing economy is still in a lockdown mode, what are the implications for the world's manufacturing community that depends heavily on exports from China, on inputs into its own domestic manufacturing production from China, and the overall relationship that China has with the global financial system? I am sure that there is at least one member of this honorable chamber who is intimately and personally familiar with the dynamism that is the Chinese economy and would be in a position to speak to the impact, inevitably, of such an economic situation evolving in China and how it would have a ripple effect around the globe. Mr. President, we then went into a war. And for those of us sitting in Barbados, in beautiful old buildings like this, we do not understand the impact of bombs dropping on us in the way that the people of Ukraine do. But what we do understand, even if it is somewhat in an esoteric way and at a distance, is that inflationary prices are impacting consumer prices and our ability to spend. But what we don't necessarily connect that to, Mr. President, is that war. It is the export of wheat and as a key input into so much of what we consume and so much of what is produced. It is the inflationary prices of fuel, including gas and oil, as a consequence of the crisis that is now enveloping Europe. And the expectation, Mr. President, is that if the war does not end before winter sets in, the circumstances will only deteriorate and not get better. Mr. President, in this same speech, what is an interesting thing that the managing director of the IMF said, it is this. She said, Mr. President, in summary, it is an interesting thing that when a war in Europe can result in famine in Africa, when challenges with fuel in Europe can result in a global downturn, when a pandemic that begins in one country and we think it can run for a day, debilitates economies for years and years still to come. Mr. President, this is the environment in which Barbados, 166 square miles, under 300,000 people on average. Census will tell us what the actual number is, we hope. But Mr. President, this is the dynamic that Barbados is navigating, facing crisis upon crisis. And so the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations, the South-South Center, ECLAC, and all of the international partners have told us a couple of things. While we are facing bigger challenges, constant challenges, and more difficult choices, there are a number of key things that we have to pay attention to. I'm going to put it in context, Mr. President. In January of this year, the IMF cut the global forecast by 4.4% for 2022. Since then, it went on to say that the global forecast and its outlook has deteriorated substantially, largely because of the war and its repercussions, inflation, financial tightening, and frequent wide-ranging lockdowns in China, and I've spoken about China before. These things are creating new bottlenecks in global supply chains and are weighing on economic activity. World Bank goes on to say this: we will be projecting a further downgrade in global growth for both 2022 and 2023. Fortunately, for most countries, some growth will still remain in positive territory, but the impact of the war will contribute to forecast downgrades in, and I want you to recall this number, 143 economies this year, accounting for 86% of global GDP. Barbados, Mr. President, is not operating in a vacuum. And despite all the things that we as citizens and as members of the public, and in our case, policymakers, would love to be able to see and to do, Mr. President, there is a certain cognizance of the global environment in which we function and the global position that the international organizations have said we are expected to find ourselves in. ECLAC went on to say this, Mr. President, for most countries, output is now expected to take even longer to return to pre-pandemic trends. Most emerging and developing countries are not just grappling with the economic fallout of war in Europe, but also the scarring effects of the pandemic crisis. And this includes job losses, learning losses, borne mainly by women and children as a result of the issues that we have faced on the social spectrum. Mr. President, this is the reality from the international community. And it is within this frame, Mr. President, that this administration has formulated first, in 2018, when we were dealing with a fiscal crisis only, a debt restructuring program, and introduced into this honorable chamber the BERT program 2018. Now, in BERT 2018, we had a different crisis. Mr. President, in BERT 2018, Barbados had lost access to international capital markets. We had had over 23 downgrades by rating agencies. In 2018, Mr. President, foreign reserves had dwindled from about $2 billion initially to down to $400 million, just about 5 weeks of import cover. Mr. President, in 2018, we had economic output averaging less than 1%, and national debt skyrocketing to 176.3% of GDP. Mr. President, this was at the time the highest in the world. This was the context of 2018. What I described when I started my presentation, Mr. President, is a vast difference from that first crisis, a fiscal crisis, to now having a COVID crisis, a crisis of war, and I haven't spoken of yet, Mr. President, of the climate crisis, which continues to have a debilitating effect in other areas, Mr. President. And those global crises, Mr. President, have created regional and national crises. They have created policy-making crises. They have created a crisis of fiscal space, Mr. President, to do all the things that our hearts desire and all the things that we would want to be able to do for our people. And Mr. President, what this administration has done is to develop what we can only at best describe as an iterative plan that acknowledges that circumstances are not constant. If 2018 into 2019 and then 2019 into 2020 taught us anything, is that the circumstances we navigated at the time required us to navigate them and pivot by the time we hit 2020. And by the time we hit 2020, Mr. President, and we put measures in place to go into 2021, 2021 happened very differently, and now we are here in 2022. There is nothing static, Mr. President. We are clear about government policy and government interventions in the market as a result of these crises. Crisis after crisis will require difficult choices, and they will require a changing and a constantly evolving response. Because I am certain, Mr. President, that the critics of government's policy would not expect that in 2022, that the government of Barbados would still be responding only narrowly to the crises that we put on the table in full visibility of the public and the people of Barbados in 2018, as if nothing has happened since then. That would surely not be logical. It would not be what is expected of us, and so the government has had to evolve a policy over time. And so what was assumed in 2018, Mr. President, with its BERT plan, restoring macroeconomic stability at the time, placing the economy on a sustainable and an inclusive growth plan, and making a commitment to treat to the important and long-standing issues that has been a bugbearer of critical public infrastructure investments then being expedited, but also, Mr. President, the long-standing and painful issue of SOE reform. Mr. President, can you imagine what it was for a government to have navigated with its foreign creditors first, then its domestic creditors, and have to be in a position where you have identified with the IMF and through your financial infrastructure that this is the level of your debt arrears? And then to discover, Mr. President, that because there was absolutely no oversight built into our system at the level of state-owned enterprises, that there were all these debts that were accumulated by disparate arms of government at the SOE level that had never been brought to book. And so government then had to, again, pivot for a second time. And we had to navigate a changing in our debt overhang as a consequence of things then being brought to book as a result of poorly structured, poorly managed SOEs, Mr. President. But those things notwithstanding, that was 2018, and the government managed to restructure its debt, and the government still managed to follow the advice that we have now seen in every single international organization to prioritize its spending in a number of key areas: education, health, capital works expansion. These are three areas, Mr. President, that you have heard this administration speaking about, some people would say ad nauseum, over and over and over and over again, because they are the established priorities, not just for this government, Mr. President, but for the international development community that has studied development and has studied national development and economic transformation and fiscal management, that these are the things that any government must always prioritize. And the IMF, in this speech, Facing Crisis Upon Crisis, makes mention of it, Mr. President. They speak about it. If we were to doubt, Mr. President, that there is a critical importance for managing the fiscal space that the government had in BERT 2018 and then now in BERT 2019, Mr. President, the IMF says this because there's a lot of discussion around the question of debt, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Mr. President, it says, maintaining access to liquidity is particularly crucial. IMF lending, currently amounting to over $300 billion, has helped member states significantly in this regard. As at summer last year, 2021, 650 billion SDR, special drawing rights, we talked about that before, have been allocated. Low-income countries are using up to 40% of their SDRs on COVID-related priorities, including essential spending. You have heard the Minister of Health, you have heard the Prime Minister, excuse me, speaking on more than one occasion about the extraordinary investment that this government made in healthcare over the last 2 years. Let's not talk about it in abstract terms, Mr. President. How many of us had the option of having to go into a public polyclinic, and having to pay for a vaccine? None of us. How many of us had the option of going into a public polyclinic and paying to be tested? If we paid to be tested, we did so by choice. We did not have to do so. Mr. President, how many people, especially in the first part of the pandemic, were able to benefit from care, including critical care, at the Harson's Point facility? Did we pay at the point of the delivery of that service, Mr. President? We remember, and I remember being chairman of the Bridgetown Port at the time that the very first ventilator landed in this country, donated by one of the cruise lines, Mr. President, and it landed at the Grand Islands International Airport. I remember the investment that government had to make in ventilation capacity in order to make sure that Barbadians could live through the onset of that first variant of COVID, Mr. President. Did we pay, any of us as individuals, for that? That was not planned expenditure, Mr. President. When the Prime Minister and the other members of government at the time went to Harson's Point and in 4 weeks managed to turn an old base into a hospital that then became critical to our management of COVID, we didn't have to pay for that. The government made sure that that was expenditure. Even if it was not planned expenditure, Mr. President, it was critical expenditure. And the government did what? The government pivoted. The government made sure that it provided the critical services that Barbadians needed at the time. And so, unplanned expenditure, the incurring of debt in order to be able to meet the critical needs of our people, and we have been able to see the exponential increase in expenditure. Mr. President, one of the things that the international community also talks about is training and education. You had a government that came in with a fiscal restructuring program, a debt restructuring program, and that is a government that still made commitments to reinstate the payment of tertiary level education for University of the West Indies students. Mr. President, the government pivoted. The government, even in times of crisis, still made critical investments in the country. Mr. President, you then have any number of capital works projects which the government started. So, Mr. President, BERT 2018 is not necessarily going to be BERT 2022. So I want to now come to some of the achievements under BERT 2018 deliberately because I want to go into BERT 2022. What are some of the achievements, Mr. President? Mr. President, the government under BERT 2018 was successful in clearing 87% of debt arrears that had been accumulated over the period of the past decade. The government did that in a period of 2 years. Mr. President, the stock of central government arrears fell from $1.2 billion to $137 million at the end of March 2020. And the government would have settled the accumulated arrears over the previous years, many of these including outstanding and long outstanding value-added tax and personal income and corporation tax. Many of us had not seen a tax return for I don't know how long, and the government undertook to settle many of those. Mr. President, the debt restructuring, even though it was challenging, and we accept that it was challenging, it also had its benefits, Mr. President. Over $1 billion, not B with a B, well, billion with a B and not with an M, was saved per annum in debt service payments for a 5-year period, and interest payments were reduced from 8% of GDP to just under 4% of GDP prior to the pandemic. Total debt service, Mr. President, amounted to 22% on every tax dollar versus what it was before at 68 cents of every tax dollar. That would have constituted 1% of GDP at the end of the financial year. The SOEs that I mentioned earlier, Mr. President, their arrears declined from approximately $755 million, Mr. President, to $61 million, or 7% of GDP at the end of March 2020. Now, Mr. President, you know, there's a narrative sometimes that we would like to have. The government didn't do nothing, but it do this, but it still didn't make a difference. Sometimes we have to check ourselves, and we have to check our hearts. My mother always used to say, what's your motive? It's not always what you do, it's why you do it. What is driving you, despite the clear evidence before you, to roll your eyes when the government says things? What is driving you to turn in a different direction, Mr. President? What is really your motive? If in the presentation of facts, the facts don't matter, and you hear some people say, don't mind them, they must always be talking and saying the same thing. You know, there are some people who are always willing to dismiss, and there are those who genuinely do not always understand what is being presented because it is not their area. Mr. President, if you come and talk to me about medical science, I can look in the opposite direction because I do not understand what you're talking about. When Senator Haynes stands up and starts to speak about the blue economy and some of the things that she has been working on, Mr. President, I have to listen because it is not my discipline and I have to be able to absorb what is being said, Mr. President. When the lawyers in here start to speak about their colleagues, I have no idea most times what they are speaking about because it is not my discipline, Mr. President. And there are those people who genuinely do not always know, like me, what we are talking about, and so we listen in order to understand. But then there are those who listen in order to reject. And it is those to whom I am referring in this instance. But it is our responsibility to put as much information as we can out there so that people can make decisions on an informed basis. And that is the commitment of this government. Mr. President, one of the key things that this BERT 2018 was able to accomplish was a restoration of investor confidence. Now, why was that necessary, Mr. President? After 23 downgrades, the question is not just about downgrades per se. We're not talking about downgrades. When people would say, oh, why does a downgrade matter? What's the big deal of a downgrade? A downgrade, kind of like if we were to go into a commercial bank and we were to say, I want to get a loan. I want a loan for $100, Mr. President, but I have a bad track record of repaying my debt. I don't pay my debts. Not me, not Lisa. I have to clarify that. But I have a bad track record of repaying my debt. And my income does not suggest that I can pay that debt. That's what a downgrade really is for a country. It is a rating of your sovereign being in the country, and your debt, your ability to pay, and your track record of paying back. Mr. President, Barbados had 23 downgrades. Clearly, we were doing really poorly. We did not have a good track record at all. Mr. President, after the BERT program of 2018, by 2019, Barbados had already benefited from 2 upgrades from the international credit rating agencies. Both Moody's and Standard & Poor increased Barbados's rating, improved Barbados's rating based on the implementation of what they described as strong fiscal and debt policies. Now, in 2022, Barbados is just notches away from being investment grade again on the S&P rating scale. And even in January this year, while other countries around us were being downgraded, Barbados maintained on part of S&P a stable outlook and received an upgrade from a new entity, Fitch. So clearly, the government is doing something right. The government is, in fact, engaging with the international community. It is engaging with its development partners because it understands that crises after crises, especially when those crises are global, require global collaboration, require multilateral solutions, and they require decisive national intervention. Mr. President, now, I want to speak specifically in this instance, Mr. President, now about what the government is looking to do under BERT 2022. It is key for us to treat to the question of debt and managing how we treat to debt, Mr. President, and what the BERT program is intended to do. Now, the BERT program for 2022 has 3 main pillars, Mr. President. Excuse me. Three main pillars there. Well, 4 main pillars. The first one is a growth strategy. I'll talk for a few minutes about that. A fiscal strategy. I've spoken to some extent about that, but I'll go into some more detail. A debt management strategy. And then finally, Mr. President, one of the things that is critical to this administration, when you are dealing with crisis after crisis after crisis, when you're dealing with soaring inflation, increasing consumer prices, the loss of income, Mr. President, in many instances, unemployment challenges, the question of social cohesion becomes even more important. And a government's investment in its social infrastructure is therefore the 4th and the final pillar of this iteration of BERT 2022, Mr. President. Those are the things, Mr. President, that this administration is navigating in 2022. But I want to say up front, crisis after crisis, time after time, everything changes year after year, not always endogenous to Barbados, but oftentimes exogenous to Barbados and into the region. We have to be in a position always to pivot. I've been using that word throughout. We have to be in a position to pivot, and we have to be responsive to the challenges of the time, in the time, and projecting for the time ahead. And when that time ahead does or does not materialize, or when changes come then too, Mr. President, we as a government have to still be prepared to pivot. That is what is required of us, and that is what we have learned, Mr. President. So let's start with the growth strategy. Let's start with the fiscal strategy first, Mr. President. Because we've talked about the reforms in places like the Barbados Revenue Authority, and I would want to take the opportunity to celebrate the work that has already started in the BRA. It is not yet there where it needs to be, but the commitment of the commissioner, the new commissioner, I don't know how new Louisa Ward still is, but she has been getting into the trenches and committing to making substantial reforms of the operations of the Barbados Revenue Authority. There have been measures already implemented, Mr. President, to modernize tax administration systems, which I spoke about there, to reduce revenue leakages. There has also been a restructuring of the tax waiver systems, which those things were always efficient. And there are also issues that have been, reforms that have been implemented, Mr. President, to address questions of expenditure leakages and also to treat the questions of public procurement. Mr. President, we have passed a Public Procurement Act. One of the first things that this administration did in 2019 was to pass a Public Finance Management Act. And if you look at the Public Finance Management Act in the respective schedules, appended at Schedules 1 and Schedules 2, you will see an outline of the management of the state-owned enterprises as well as the commercial state-owned enterprises now being brought to book and ensuring that their financial management never again puts the government of Barbados at the central government level into a position where they have accumulated arrears and debts that are not in any way correlated to central government's finances. And so those measures have already been put in place in the government. The reform and restructuring of state-owned enterprises is a significant initiative, and it is still very much underway in BERT 2. Work has already begun, Mr. President. I now have taken responsibility for a new ministry, Energy and Business, and under that ministry includes one of the entities that I have heard time after time after time after time over the course of the last week. Well, actually today is a week that I have been in this seat. KIPO. And so the reform of KIPO is a critical component of what this administration has to do with state-owned enterprises. And I am committed, as were my predecessors, to ensuring that we are in a position to reform that entity once and for all in order to make Barbados a place where you can do business efficiently and effectively in a timely manner. Mr. President, but KIPO is just one. You have the Urban Development Commission, the Rural Development Commission, National Housing Corporation, the Agricultural Management Trust, Agricultural Management Fund. All of these are entities that are in the need of state-owned enterprise reform. And this administration, Mr. President, has identified a dedicated team already functioning within government who have been given responsibility for the reform of each one of these entities. And so we know who these are team members already constituting the government's economic and financial team, and they are responsible, and we have divided up the state-owned enterprises among the team in order to ensure that we are able to go in and to do reform. The Barbados Tourism Marketing Inc., for example, is not one of those entities that comes on a public purse. It is not a taxpayer money per se funded entity. The Barbados Tourism Marketing Inc. is funded on the airport service charge paid by visitors on departure from Barbados. And it is capitalized, therefore, on the basis of travel in and out of Barbados and not from the consolidated fund. It has a cap in the legislation where X amount of resources would go to the BTMI and the remaining resources that come in from the ASC then go to the consolidated fund. But the government in 2018 made an announcement, and it is still committed to ensuring that it can deliver on that, which is that the BTMI must now transition into a public-private sector partnership where it is able to have a collaborative arrangement that helps to capitalize the functioning of the BTMI between the public sector and the private sector. And that is, again, another example of how we are treating to SOE reform. So could you imagine, Mr. President, if there is a PPP around the BTMI, for example, as an example, you now have a scenario where the resources that would come from the airport service charge to capitalize that entity could arguably be assigned to some of the critical work that needs to be done in country, even as we continue to market the country. We have the Grantley Adams International Airport that was not included in 2020. Mr. President, this is an example of how we pivoted. In 2018, when we started this process, the Grand Island International Airport was not included. Why? Because it was constituted as a commercial state-owned enterprise for the purposes of the Public Finance Management Act Schedule 2, as a commercial state-owned enterprise that is able to be self-financing, much like the Bridgetown Port. It receives no money from the Consolidated Fund historically. For the first time in its history, Mr. President, COVID came and arrivals plummeted. People were no longer arriving and traveling, and I've already mentioned that these entities are capitalized by travel, not from the central government purse, not from the Barbadian taxpayers. And so, Mr. President, when that entity then saw COVID happen over the course of 2020 into 2021, for the first time in its history, central government had to provide financial resources to both the Barbados Tourism Marketing Inc. and to the Grand Island International Airport. We've never done so before, we never had to, but we had to do it then in order to keep these entities functioning. Because nobody went home from the airport, nobody went home from BTMI because we still had salaries to pay and people to look after, Mr. President, and that was the commitment of this government. We had to pivot. We had to pivot. So now here we are in 2022, and the restructuring of these organizations is now firmly back on the agenda for the government of Barbados, and the expectation is that under BERT 2022, there will be a significant and a transformational restructuring of our state-owned enterprises. Mr. President, I also want to spend a moment on the growth strategy because this is critical. This is critical. Growth is no longer what we may have thought it to be in times past. Growth has to be predicated on a number of pillars, Mr. President, and you have heard on more than one occasion our Prime Minister speaking about the emerging markets. It's a strange thing because when I sat in a tourism chair, anytime I spoke about Africa or the Latin America region, eyes would glaze over. People were like, that's not the market. If it was not the UK, people just weren't terribly interested. That was the reality. But now we have entities like the IMF, like the World Bank, like the United Nations, like the South-South Center, talking about the importance of South-South collaboration. The Global South in Africa and the Global South in the Americas collaborating and creating direct linkages, Mr. President. And so if it was one thing that came out positively from the cessation in travel to some of our major metropoles, it has been a focusing on people who look, sound a little bit, and move like us. And that becomes one of the key planks, Mr. President, for an expansion strategy. It's why you saw the active conference being held here just a few weeks ago, Mr. President. It's why you see the Prime Minister speaking about collaboration between Barbados and Guyana, because we're talking here also in this IMF crisis upon crisis about the issues of food security, the issues of energy security. Prime Minister has been speaking about it, and it's captured in the growth trajectory of the BERT 2022 program. The expansion and the investment, Mr. President, in renewables, in the greening of the economy. There has to be also, Mr. President, an investment in the sectors of the future. We've seen fintech. We heard earlier someone speaking, one of the honorable members speaking about things like cryptocurrencies, new forms of financial investment, Mr. President. Those are the sectors of the future. But within the traditional sectors, Mr. President, you have a diversification even within, let's use the example of international transport. Mr. President, in a few weeks, I hope to have the opportunity to speak about a bill, well, in a little while I hope, to have the opportunity to speak about a bill that is before this chamber and was debated last week in the other place, that I spent probably close to 18 months from start to finish working with the extraordinary teams on. Mr. President, when we talk about international transport, we're talking also about aviation. We're talking about maritime. And the development of new growth industries is not just about within our traditional sectors, Mr. President, like tourism, expanding our share of the market in established markets. It is also about diversifying within existing traditional sectors, Mr. President. So tourism, for its part, must also continue to diversify, but it also must be planked on anchors like international transport. It is why we are proposing in the BERT 2022 to have a logistics hub, Mr. President. It is why that logistics hub is connected to the expansion of our maritime and our aviation sectors. It is why, Mr. President, we are looking at the expansion of new businesses and new sectors and a new creation of opportunities in aviation and in maritime, because those things then consolidate to give effect to our food security push and our collaboration between Barbados and Guyana. Anybody thought that because that Prime Minister and our Minister of Agriculture are spending so much time working with Guyana just because they are our neighbors? No, that can't make no sense. They're spending so much time because the hottest economy in the world now is Guyana. The fastest growing economy in the world is Guyana. And the closest country that has been partnering with Guyana over the last few years has been Barbados. On Friday, last week, we launched a training portal between Barbados and Guyana to be able to upskill some of their workers to prepare using the National Transformation Initiative for their emerging sectors. That creates an opportunity for Barbados. You have the Minister of Agriculture and the Prime Minister and their counterparts in Guyana collaborating on the creation of a food terminal in Barbados, which consolidates production here in Barbados between Barbados and Guyana and northern Brazil, Roima, and shipping here using the Deepwater Harbor and the aviation sector to create transshipment opportunities for Barbados from the fastest growing economy in the world. It is not an esoteric thing. These things are all connected, Mr. President, all connected. When we talk about the relationship with Africa, Mr. President, the discussions between Barbados and the Caribbean and the Africa Exim Bank have been about how do we then use that platform here in Barbados for a logistics hub to open up new lanes for maritime transportation between the Caribbean and the African continent, Mr. President, and from the African continent via Barbados in the south down to the South American region. Those are the things that we are now including in an expansionary trajectory that is meant to stimulate growth. Are they going to happen overnight? No. Will they take time? Yes. But are we committed as a government to ensuring that we lay the institutional scaffolding that will give rise to them? Yes, we are, Mr. President. We also now have, Mr. President, a mechanism, and I want to just bring my presentation somewhat to a close by speaking for a few moments about the mechanisms that will be put in place to monitor this thing. The government is not monitoring itself. We, in 2018, had a BERT monitoring committee that was a subset of the social partnership. It was led by the private sector, and they independently monitored the application and the implementation of the BERT program. By the end of this year, Mr. President, and we are already in November, we are hoping that the government will be in a position to announce the creation of a new public-private sector growth council that will be drawn from a number of places, and Prime Minister will speak on that, how it will be constituted, but it is meant to map growth over the medium term to ensure that it is private sector driven and export led, and it will focus on the following planks, Mr. President: incentivizing the private sector and public investment in climate resilient infrastructure and green transitionary tools, incentivizing the private sector and public investment in low and middle income housing, investing in skills development and training, including utilization of online tools like the NTI, which I mentioned earlier, in order to enhance the human capacity development of our population, preserving financial stability and mobilizing domestic services for local investment in order to facilitate investment opportunities for as many Barbadians as possible. We've also identified another area, Mr. President, which will be making government an enabler to enhance productivity, competitiveness, and service excellence towards achieving higher local and foreign direct investment in our economic sectors, both traditional and non-traditional. Establishing Barbados as a logistics hub, I've spoken about that. which will then in turn create the regional and international economic linkages. I've talked about that in order to improve our exports and our export capacity. Now, Export Barbados is doing some tremendous work, and I'm looking forward to collaborating with Export Barbados and the creation of a tripartite type relationship between my own ministry, with responsible for commerce and trade, foreign trade, which is responsible for foreign trade in terms of the agreements, and industry with responsibility for Export Barbados, which is the export-led entity. And so the three of us anchoring the productive sectors domestically and stimulating that productive sector growth and that private sector-led growth in order to drive investment outward using the mechanism that is Export Barbados in its new incarnation, Mr. President. We've also agreed that we will be looking at economic diversification through the development of new niche sectors, particularly in the knowledge-based economy, and we've talked about life sciences at great length in many instances. And then ultimately, Mr. President, improving productivity and adopting open labor market policies in order to ensure that we can promote stronger and equitable, resilient growth. These are, Mr. President, some of the elements that are incorporated in the growth agenda of the BERT 2022 program. There's so much more that I could say, but I can't say it now, Mr. President, in the interest of time. But what I will say, I will close with this quote, which I referenced earlier. And this is a quote from the IMF in this instance. It says this: "In a world where war in Europe creates hunger in Africa, where a pandemic can circle the globe in days and reverberate for years, where emissions anywhere mean rising sea levels everywhere, the threat to our collective prosperity from a breakdown in global collaboration cannot be overstated. The only effective remedy to these risks is international cooperation. It is our only hope for a fairer and more resilient future, and it is our duty." Mr. President, when our Prime Minister travels to COP in Cairo this week to speak to the world's leaders on climate change, when she travels to Washington, D.C., along with our Ministry of Foreign Affairs officials to speak about the global financial architecture, when she advocates for special drawing rights for countries like Barbados from the IMF, when she advocates for a fairer and more moral leadership approach to how global issues are navigated, Mr. President, what she is speaking to, Mr. President, is a world that I just described that is highly interdependent and facing crisis after crisis, which in turn requires a response. I am confident, Mr. President, that the responses of the government of Barbados may not be perfect. I am confident that there are always things that could be done differently. But I'm also confident, Mr. President, that this is a government and an administration that has aligned itself with the international community and identified best practices and looked at the development trajectory which is required for countries of all stages in life, but in particular countries like ours that are developing and need to be able to position itself in a world where we must always be able to pivot. I am confident that this resolution before this honourable chamber is well poised to treat to the issues before us. I am confident that our debt management strategy is what it needs to be with the guidance and the oversight of the international community. I am confident that the balance between debt and expenditure is being driven, Mr. President, by a debt management framework and a growth strategy that is meant to increase our revenues. And I am confident that the work that I have not even begun to mention, Mr. President, including the outcomes of the Population Commission, which create a direct correlation between the size of the population and GDP growth and debt service capacity, that all of those things, when they come into the fullness of time, will contribute to Barbados being well positioned to recover from crisis after crisis, and then be in a position to say, we are moving forward into a transformational future for our people, led by the government of Barbados. And with these few words, I beg to move that this resolution do now pass.
Thank you, Senator Cummins. Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this honorable chamber do now break for lunch for 1 hour and return at 2:50 p.m.
The question is that this sitting be suspended until 2:50 p.m. Honourable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. The things the ayes have it. This sitting is therefore suspended until 2:50 p.m. today.